Welcome back, I'm Bill, and today I'm finally making the video that's been so often requested, and that is how to rebuild and service a Coleman double-mantle lantern, specifically a Coleman 220 or a 228. This video will also serve you if you're working on a Sears double-mantle lantern that was made by Coleman. These are basically 220s, and in this case it's a 228. If you don't know, the difference between a 220 and a 228 is the size of the vent, and then the 228s have a wider bail to clear that vent, but otherwise the lanterns are identical. I will be working today on this Canadian 220F. These are far less rare than the American 220Fs, which are everywhere south of the border. In fact, if you're in the States and you end up with Grandpa's old lantern and you just want to get it working, this video is for you. And you've probably got a 220F or a 228F or maybe an E variety because they're so common down there. They aren't so common up here. These lanterns were made in this design with this style valve, and this video should assist you with any of them in the family from the 220 or 228A, made in the late 20s in Canada, the 220, 228B, made in both countries starting about 1930, 1931, and the American versions all the way up through the 220 and 228F, which will get you through 1973. And in Canada, they discontinued the 220s and 228s when World War II began and reintroduced them in 1962. So we've got this guy's older brother. This is a Canadian 220E. In terms of what you need to know from this video, they're both the same. The difference, this is steel, this is brass. So there are other Coleman double-mantle lanterns that are outside this family. Of course, the very first generation of the 220 and 228, often referred to as the slant, their inner workings are significantly different, so this video is not for that. Before that, you've got the old quick lights and the arrow lights. Those will require their own video. And of course, in the US, they continued making the 220 and the 228 after 1973. They went from the F, there isn't a G, there is sort of, but for all intents and purposes there's not. But there's an H, a J, and a K. And while they look very similar, and if you can manage everything in this video, you should be able to take one of those apart and recognize the differences. They're much simpler. The reason why I'm sure I've had so many requests for a 220 or 228 video is simply because these are more complicated and people get themselves into trouble taking them apart. Most of the single mantle lanterns, there's just a single screw down on in the burner cage. You take that off and everything lifts off and it's easy to work on. 220s and 228s are a little different. So this is for those, again, in Canada, the A, the B, the E, and the F. And in the US, everything from the B through the F. So let me reposition things so you can see better, and I will start to tear into this. Hopefully you can see better now. The only thing I've done to this lantern so far, I did clean the glass, and I put some penetrating oil at the base of the air tube. Those are notorious for sticking, although this lantern has clearly seen very little use. Either that or it's been extremely well maintained, and so I expect we aren't going to have any issues with that. But you just might when you take yours apart. So I've already put some penetrating oil in there. I'm not going to go into details on everything here. My goal here is to show you what to do to take this apart, to get you pointed in the right direction for servicing or replacing parts, and most of the details on those things, like using citric acid and buffing wheel to make the brass parts really shine, for example, I will point you to other videos, or replacing the graphite packing, things like that. I will simply show you how this comes apart, how to access things, and point you in those directions. So we'll try to make this video shorter than many of the other ones I've made. So we'll just take the ball nut off here and the vent. You'll notice the Canadian vents are a different design than the American vents, but they serve the same purpose. I've got a little bin here to put my parts in so they don't get lost or on the floor. The thing that makes these difficult is that they've got a two-part valve, and we'll see that here momentarily. So we'll take the generator off. This is a 7/16 nut. I think all of these sizes are the same regardless of what generation you're looking at, but you may find that yours has a different size, and that's okay. One of the reasons I often use an adjustable crescent wrench. So I've taken the jam nut off, I lifted the generator up. We need to get our cleaning needle out. So to do that, we'll rotate the lever up, slide that up into the generator, and then the whole generator will slide out. Now, you may choose at this point just to replace the generator. It's easy to do. They aren't that expensive. I never replace generators unless they're physically broken. I always clean them. You can check out my video. Oh, there's a link up above. You can check out my video on how to refurbish a generator. I personally don't see any reason to throw them away when all they need is a cleaning. Now, we don't want to bend the tip cleaning actuator. So I think that is 3/8. There are two nuts on here. There's a packing nut and there's a graphite packing inside here, which is cinched down by that nut, and that keeps fuel from leaking out around this shaft. What we want to do is we don't want to mess with that. We want to remove this back nut. Once we've got it to that point, we should. Sometimes you can just use the tip cleaning lever. Now, these tip cleaning actuators aren't really serviceable. Oops, putting on the wrong nut there. If it's hard to turn, you might try using a propane torch and adding just a little bit of heat to it. That will often free up the graphite. You can also loosen the packing nut a bit and then retighten it, and that will often free it up and make it work better. You want a little bit of resistance when you turn this, but not a lot. And basically you'll know if it's not tight enough because you may have a little bit of fuel leaking out of the out from around the shaft there. But that graphite packing, you can replace the graphite packing down here in the valve, but not really here. Generally, you just replace this whole assembly. There isn't really anything easily serviceable in here. If you want, you can, on these, you can, at least unlike on the 200s or the 242s, you can undo this nut and back it out, and you can see about replacing that with graphite packing rope. But on these, frankly, it's easier. I rarely replace parts. I fix what's broken, but these are readily available and easier just to replace. So now we've got, there's an eccentric block down in there. We don't want to lose it, so usually just turn it upside down and this little part will fall out. The hook on the generator goes through this hole, and then this bent part of the wire interfaces with that slot, and when you rotate this, it moves the eccentric block up and down. So you don't want to lose this piece. And also, if it doesn't come out, just leave it in there. Don't grab it by the top and try to yank it out. This is brass, it'll snap off. Now, this is one place where the Canadian models are a little different. I don't know if maybe the American ones, some of the older ones may have been this way, but you'll see there's a retaining screw here, and this keeps the burner frame, or the burner manifold from rotating around. I can tell this is a little wobbly, although that's up here at the top. On yours, the screw may be directly in the back here. It's a difficult angle, as you can see. You want to make sure that you've got a screwdriver that gets a nice, good, solid bite in that slot. You might want to add some penetrating oil to it before you do this, because they're notorious. This is brass and the valve is brass, so it shouldn't rust together. But on some models, that screw is the screw is steel, and they can get pretty rusty. So this, I barely put any pressure on that, and it unscrewed. But usually you won't be so lucky, and you don't want that head to snap off. If you use penetrating oil and it still won't come off, let it soak overnight. You can use a propane torch and just add a little bit of heat. Just make sure you've emptied the fuel tank before you apply any kind of fire or propane torch or anything like that to the lantern. So now that that's out, we can rotate the air tube. That screw actually goes through a hole in the air tube, as we'll see. And this, you may have to put some pliers on that to turn it out, but in this case it's turning pretty easily for me. So I really don't know that this saw a whole lot of use. These parts are brass on brass, so they shouldn't rust together unless you've got like a 220BX. You can watch my video on that where I rebuild and restore that. That was bad. And you can see there's a little hole there. That should, when we put it back together, line up with that hole, and then that screw will go in there. Some of the older ones, like the 220Bs, there will be two parts. There's one part that goes into the bottom, and then there's the main burner tube like this that screws in on top of it. There we go. Now, as far as this goes, it probably doesn't need to be taken apart any further, and there's a really good chance you won't be able to take the air tube out of the manifold. This screw here on Mini is notorious for being rusted permanently in place, and if you try to get it out, you'll just snap the head off. I have put some penetrating oil on this, and we'll see. That was, like I said, I wonder how many times this lantern was actually used. That was very easy. Maybe the penetrating oil did it, but I suspect it was just, this hasn't been used much. This turns out, but first we have to take these caps off. The reason why you want to take the burner apart, if you can, is because, and it doesn't happen much where I live on Vancouver Island. I guess we don't have those kind of bugs or spiders, but it can happen, in many places it does. You'll get spiders that crawl up into these air tubes, and they'll build webs, or mud daubers like to get in there, and they will make their mud nests, and it will block the airflow. So you'll get the whole lantern clean, everything will seem fine, and it won't burn properly because it's being starved for air. So if you can get this apart, get it apart. And what you want to do is run, if you've got some round brushes, you can buy a set of round brushes on Amazon or AliExpress for just a couple of dollars. Run those down through the tube. Even if you can't get it apart, at least run it down here, blow it out with compressed air, something to make sure there's nothing in there. Some people will put a zip tie and put it in their drill chuck and stick it down in there and then twist it around, and that'll grab or break up anything that's in there. Because what you really don't want to happen is go to all this work and then find out that there's a mud dauber nest in there or something. So for the tubes, ideally we can get them off by grabbing hold of the burner caps. While you're doing this, make sure the screens are okay. If they're okay, it's less essential you take this apart. If the screens are damaged, one tiny little hole is all right. But anything more than that, or if the screens are missing or completely rusted out or something like that, or just burned out from use, you need to get these caps off so that you can put new screens in there. And you can buy new screens from places like Old Coleman Parts. Preferably don't grab onto the tube. These are brass and you'll crush them or leave marks on them. I've got some pliers that have been wrapped with tape so I don't mar anything up. You can buy some pliers that already have plastic or vinyl on them, and that thought it broke loose. There we go. If these don't come apart that easily, again, penetrating oil down in here, and you can heat it, and if that doesn't do it, heat and quench the shock of shocking it with the heat, and then the cold will often break the threads free. So if you can get these tubes off, you don't need to take the burner caps off. And in fact, on some of the later models, the burner caps are permanently affixed to the tubes. As long as you can inspect it, look down in there, these are clean. And if you want to clean them further, you can run a brush through those and all of that. We'll get into that in a bit. And then now we've got that apart. Further, you could take the vent stud out, but there really isn't any reason to do that, and these are notorious for snapping off. So I wouldn't bother with that. The penetrating oil off my hands. Now we get into the fun part. These are where 220s and 228s are difficult. Before you get into this, you want to have something to protect the fount from this collar when it comes free, because this fount's painted, and this paint is really nice, which is unusual on these. I don't want that to scratch the paint up, so you can use a piece of cardboard like I've got. I work on these so seldom this works for me. If you work on them a lot, you may want to take a lid from something like a yogurt container and cut a slot in it so it'll fit around the valve and sit underneath there. The other thing is, this is a 9/16 nut here that holds the cage down. And if you try to get in here with, like this actually works pretty well, but not every 9/16 wrench will get in there that easily. So some people will actually bend one of these so that they can stick it down there and turn it. I've seen some people grind these so that they're flat or narrower so they fit in there. What works extremely well, if you've got a mil-spec, this is from a 530 stove, similar to a mil-spec, or if you've got a mil-spec lantern, the wrench is actually designed exactly for this, and you can stick it in there and unscrew that retainer nut. And we'll just screw it all the way up. You can see now our cage is freely spinning. So hopefully we've got enough room. I need to free it up a bit more. As high as it wants to go. And that's interesting that there's not enough room to get my cardboard under there, which is rather odd, which suggests to me that maybe the valve is, well, it shouldn't be. So I'm just going to have to live dangerously, but normally you'd slide that under there. Now, if I had a piece of plastic from a lid, that might just fit under there. But in this case, I'm just going to be as careful as I can. You need to get this off. The valve is in two pieces. There's the valve itself down here, and then this is, we'll call it the tip cleaner assembly, or the tip cleaner portion of the valve. What people do wrong here is they'll grab it with pliers, or they'll take a big crescent wrench and put it on here and just try to turn it off. These are notorious for being tight, and what happens if you put a wrench on this end and you torque it, you'll smash this opening and you won't be able to thread the tip cleaner back in. It happens all the time. In fact, some people who do like to work on them that way will actually take an old tip cleaner and they'll just snip the lever off so they can screw that in and grab it with pliers or a wrench and not crush it. I found on the Canadian ones, they're not as tight typically, so you can sometimes put a wrench on the back here. But again, you do not want to crush this soft brass ring. So there are various ways that people recommend doing this. But what I'm going to suggest, and I think this is similar to what they taught in the Coleman service training, take a 1/2-inch box end wrench, and it'll fit right over that tip cleaner assembly. Mine is short. Some people like it so that it sticks up past the burner cage. It doesn't really matter. The whole thing's going to be turning anyways. And then take a long screwdriver and stick it in there and turn. See, this turned pretty easily. Sometimes what ends up happening is instead of the upper part of the valve breaking free from the lower part, the whole valve spins out of the fount and then you have it all stuck together. If that happens, don't worry about it. You'll just take everything off and then you can put some pliers on, or put a large wrench, or you can even put the valve in a vise and turn this upper part off. So that's the tip cleaner part. And now it is interesting. This has a lot of gunk in there, which I did not expect. That's okay. Now, at this point, these fuel system parts like the valve, if you're doing a minimal rebuild on these, really all you probably need to do is shoot some carburetor or brake cleaner through there just to make sure you get any varnish or fuel residue out or anything like that. I'll talk about what I do with these parts when we get them all off. So now the burner frame just lifts off. We'll set that aside. The collar moves forward and comes off. And it looks like it's probably some thread locker that was on there. And I'll set the collar aside. So this would be a good point. If your fount is not in the best shape, if it looks like it's been damaged, if it's got rust on it, this would be a good point to do a pressure test. And I'm not going to show you how to do that. It's relatively simple to do. Just pump it up. This probably could use a little oil, but it seems to be working. Make sure the valve is closed. And we'll do this before we remove the valve. So pump it up. Over-pressurize it. Put in, instead of 25 or 30 pumps, put in 50, 60, 70. Well, before you do anything else, you could just listen. And if you hear any hissing, try to figure out where it's coming from. But what you want to do at this point, make sure the fuel cap is tight. Lock the pump down. At this point, you may want to take the pump out so you can see if it's the check valve. And dunk this in a bucket full of water, put it in the sink, and look for any bubbles. If there are bubbles coming out here, you know that the valve may need some work. The stem may not be sealing properly. If you see bubbles around the fuel cap, you know you need a new cap gasket. If you see bubbles coming, that's why you might want to take the pump out before you do that, so that because there's air trapped in this tube. And that's not a leak. But if you take it out and dunk it, let water go into the tube, you'll see if the check valve is sealing or not, because bubbles may be released from it. So that's a good thing to do if your fount looks sketchy. You don't have to worry about the brass rusting, but all of these at least have steel on the bottom, and that steel can rust. So that's something to keep in mind, is to do a dunk test or a pressure test for safety's sake. If your fount is potentially problematic, if it's got rust on it or something like that. So at this point, I'll take the fuel cap off. This cap gasket's pretty hard, and it would probably be worth replacing if you're just doing this the easy way. You don't care what it looks like, you don't care if everything's original, you can buy a new fuel cap. It'll have a new gasket in it, or you can buy new gaskets from places like Old Coleman Parts. I'm not sure if Coleman themselves sells just the gasket. They probably only sell the whole cap, and of course the new caps are plain brass, so it won't look the same. But you can check out my video on fuel caps and replacing gaskets. If you've got a 3-piece fuel cap, those are really easy to replace the caps, and you don't have to worry about accidentally gouging your fingers trying to dig the old one out. Before we take the valve out, let's go ahead and get the valve out. I'm going to take this is a 1/2 inch. Nope, that is a 9/16. Actually, before we do that, I'll even go ahead and go this far and take the screw out. And the direction disc. We'll keep the knob handy because we may need to put that back on to get this out. Yeah, that's a 9/16, but I'm going to use an adjustable wrench on it because it's just too tight. So this is the jam nut. Now, at this point, if you have a lantern with a brass fount, this is where you want to be careful, because if this is tight and you put this torque on it, you can twist the valve and you'll end up dimpling or disforming the top of the fount. Very easy to do on a brass fount. Steel founts like this, not really a problem. And that can also be an issue when you take the valve out. And if you're servicing one of these, you really do want to take the valve out, because if you've got a fuel system problem, chances are that's where it is down inside the fount. All right, there's our jam nut. Now we'll put the valve wheel back on and we'll unscrew it. Whereas on like the single mantle lanterns, typically the packing, the graphite packing is actually in that nut. On these, it's on the valve stem. So we want to get the valve stem out, and what you want to do is just, it'll feel like you're forcing it. You turn it really, really hard, and see this graphite is starting to come out, and it's all broken up. So that means we need to replace the graphite packing on this, and probably need to pull a bit to get that out. Put the screw back in. Usually they're not this hard, but the whole lantern can't be that easy to take apart. There we go. And you can see that graphite packing just completely went to bits. They normally don't do that, but this did. So you can buy a brand new packing from old Coleman parts. Maybe Coleman sells them as well. Since old Coleman parts, I'm sure, gets them from Coleman. You can probably buy graphite packing directly from them. It's a little cylinder that's already in the right shape and all of that. They fit, so you'll take the knob off. So when you replace it, these are really easy to do. You'll slide this larger retainer ring off. There's another retainer ring on here, and it's flat on one side, and you can tell which side goes toward the packing because it's covered in graphite. The other side is beveled, and that bevel sits against this little wire clip that's wrapped around there. So that's how you know which way it goes. Anyhow, you slide the graphite packing on, put this retainer ring on, and then when you put it back together and cinch down the valve, or cinch down the jam nut, it'll squish the packing into place and everything will be fine. Now, I will be using this graphite plumbing rope to replace this packing. This works just as well, and I have a video you can click above, and I've got a video that shows you just how to do that. All right, so now to get the valve out. This is, again, I think it is a 9/16. This wrench probably is not big enough, and they do put some kind of a thread locker on there. At one point I did hear what Coleman used. I don't recall what it was called anymore. My experience is Canadian valves aren't usually as tight. I don't work on many American lanterns, but the American ones are usually really tight. And so there are several options at this point. And some of it depends on whether you've got a steel fount like this or a brass fount like this, because again, brass, if you put this on its side and put a wrench on it and torque on it, you'll probably bend the brass. Steel, you don't have to worry about that. So a few things you can do. You can put this upside down in a vise and then twist it off. Sometimes on the American ones, I found they're so tight, even then you need to use like a strap wrench or something to get the torque. You can put a 9/16 socket, or I can, just put a crescent wrench, or if you've got a large 9/16 wrench, you can put it on there and see if it'll come off. On American ones, assuming I'm not dealing with a brass fount, I will usually just put a 9/16 inch socket on there and use an impact driver, impact wrench, and that'll spin it out in a heartbeat. So this is a Canadian lantern, so I'm going to guess it's not overly tight. So what I'm going to do is just try to use this big crescent wrench. And usually, and it is tight. So that tells me it's time for, the vise might work. I don't have my vise set up right now, so the impact wrench is easier, so that'll be the next step. So, all right, so we've got the big guns here. One key here, and this is important, make sure before you use an impact gun you've got the knob off, because this thing will go spinning around, and you don't want this hitting your hand. So that made it really easy. Okay, so that's we'll take the pump out in a minute. This is the bottom half of the valve, and then if you're going to have fuel system problems, more than likely they're going to be down here in the fuel and air tube. I don't know what all of this dry, crusty stuff is on there. At this point, I'm not even going to try a wrench on all that crusty stuff, but it may have a hex fitting on here, or it may just be round. Most Canadians are round. I'm kind of surprised at this. So if it's got a hex on it, use a wrench. If it doesn't, grab some pliers and just twist it off. And this actually looks pretty good, but what typically happens, this spring gets compressed over time and it needs to be stretched out. So before we put it back together, we'll stretch that out. This is a metering rod. Coleman calls it an air wire, and it runs down into the fuel and air tube. This fuel and air tube is actually an inner tube and then an outer tube. There's a hole at the top here. Some may have more than one hole, or some are crimped in and they leak around the top. And there's a little tiny hole down here at the bottom, and this is your fuel pickup. So if you just were to open the valve and fuel flowed freely from here up to the cold generator, you'd flood the lantern and you'd have a fireball. This is why the early lanterns required preheating. What Coleman figured out, they came up with this instant light circuit, and what happens is, this of course goes into the valve, and where's that stem? The tip of the stem, when this is pushed, or when the valve stem is pushed all the way in, it holds this rod down. As you back the stem out, the rod pops up. So when the rod is down, that air wire, that metering rod, mostly blocks the orifice at the bottom. And that limits the amount of fuel. So you get a little bit, and mostly what happens though is air that you've pumped into the top of the fount runs down through this hole, runs through the outer tube, down to the bottom, and then back up through the inner tube and out the top here. As it does so, it picks up that little bit of fuel that's leaking in around the bottom. And so you get just enough fuel to light the lantern without it flooding. And the flame that you get initially, that flare-up you get, is controlled that way, and that will heat the generator. And then once the generator's hot, the lantern's running properly, you unscrew the stem, back it out, the air wire pops up, and you get full access to the fuel. So two problems that you want to look for here. One, this spring gets compressed, and the air wire just sits down there, blocking it, and it won't pop up. So before we put this back together, we want to make sure that spring stress is stretched out. This one looks good. You could stretch it out a little bit, just don't break it. If it does break, surprisingly, what works fine is a spring from a ballpoint pin. Not quite as strong, but it gets the job done. The other thing you want to make sure is that this hole is clean. If it's got any fuel varnish or any other buildup on there, it may completely seal around the air wire, and when the lantern's in the instant light, or when the instant light circuit is active, when the metering rod is down, you simply will get no fuel. So the lantern won't have that pre-light, that initial controlled flare that heats the generator, and you'll have trouble lighting it. So we want to make sure that that's clean. So I'll set these aside briefly, and we will take the pump out, because that's another issue you may have. You can see this, I could pump it up, but it wasn't great. Usually just some needle nose pliers on this clip. Older ones will have 2 screws. Don't lose those screws because they're unobtainium, but just take the clip off and pull this out. If this is stuck on, usually just pull this all the way out and give it a yank, and that'll usually pull it free. Sometimes oil gets built up around there. Now, if all you're wanting to do is get the lantern working, make sure the pump cup is in good shape. This is kind of hard. If I tried to open it up, it would probably crack or break, but it's not completely hard. So this is still a good pump cup. It just needs to be oiled, and it'll work fine after that. You can take these apart. On the older ones, there'll be a nut that screws on here. Starting in the 70s, you get ones like this. They have a push-on clip, and they're kind of a bear to get off, but you can get them off. That's what I've got on my hand there. You can get them off, but you've got to pry that little thing off. So in this case, you can put this in a little cup of oil and let it sit overnight. That's probably more than sufficient, and then wipe off the excess, put it back in, or you can actually take it off and soak it. And if the leather is bad, you can buy new pump cups from Coleman. I think they just sell the whole assembly, or Old Coleman Parts sells new leather cups, and you can replace the whole leather cup. The one other thing that may be a problem for you is the check valve. So we'll take out this air stem. This is what the pump slides up and down on, and it's sort of the fail-safe for sealing the check valve so it doesn't leak back out. The check valve is down at the bottom. Lets air into the fountain when you pump it, keeps it from coming back out. If it leaks, you'll have trouble keeping pressure in the lantern, and you'll need to replace it. This is one of those things, if you've got the right tool, it's really easy. If you don't have the right tool, you can do some damage, and it's not worth it. So if you don't have the tool, don't stick a screwdriver down in there and try and get it out, because I'll show you in a minute. The check valve is made out of brass, and the slot can be easily damaged, and then you have to use, like a screw out or something like that in order to get it out, and you'll make a mess. You'll destroy the check valve, and that can be a pain. So I fit this tool in. It's got ears on it. The central screw goes in where the air stem screws in the middle, and then this outer part has 2 ears that fit into the slot. And all I have to do then is, trying to do things backwards here for the camera. And I'll have to do it right way around. Very easy if you've got the right tool. Here's the problem. If you just stick a big screwdriver down there, you might get lucky, but there's a good chance you won't, and you'll strip this out. And you can use a screw out to get it out, but you'll destroy the check valve. Now, on anything later than a 220D or a 228D, no big deal. Coleman sells these, Old Coleman Parts sells these. They used the same check valve in everything after World War II pretty much, so it's easy, and you can hear it rattle. So this one's probably good, but I'll clean it anyways. But if you've got something like a 220B or a 220C, the check valve is different. You can still get those from Old Coleman Parts, but they're more expensive, so preferably you don't want to mess with that. So if it's holding pressure, if the check valve seems to be just fine, if you don't have the tool, I'd go ahead and leave it in there. To clean it, usually all you need is shoot some carburetor cleaner through there. If you really need to, you can soak it in vinegar, white vinegar, or citric acid, and that will clean stuff out. But anything that's acidic, you run the risk if it's in there too long, you can end up pitting the little ball that's in there, and it won't, you may have issues with it sealing. So my suggestion is shoot carb cleaner through there, even soak it in a little cup of carb cleaner overnight if you need to. See if that does it. If that doesn't do it, then you can move on to other things. But that's your check valve. So what do we need to do to get this working, to get the parts working before we put them back together? Again, like I said, sort of the minimalist thing to do if you just want to get the lantern working and you don't really care what it looks like, shoot carburetor cleaner through everything. Shoot it through the valve, shoot it through the tip cleaner from the bottom out the top, top out the bottom. Inspect your valve. If it was leaking out the valve, chances are someone's really reefed on it and there may be a groove or it's pitted on here. That can often be fixed just by buffing it on a buffing wheel with some polishing compound. It's not the most common problem, but it can happen, so you might run your finger on there. This is dirty, but it's smooth, so no issues there. The biggest thing when you've got this apart is you want to clean your fuel and air tube. This, at the very least, shoot some carburetor cleaner through there. Take the air wire, stick it in backwards from the bottom, work it around. This is definitely something that I wouldn't neglect to soak. At least the air wire is fine, but soak this part in some white vinegar or citric acid. That'll cut any fuel garbage, like varnish or anything like that that's in there. It'll be nice and clean. One thing I like to do is use a toothpick and very carefully stick a toothpick in there and rotate it. Be careful, you don't want to break the toothpick off in the hole, but the toothpick is really good at sort of scrubbing out the hole to make sure there's nothing clogging anything like that. Just don't break it off. I mean, if you do, you can poke it back out with the air wire. So I'm kind of doing a full restoration on this, so I am going to put all these parts in citric acid, and you'll see them all nice and shiny when they come back. That'll take all the crud off. One thing you should be aware of, things like the tip cleaner assembly, I would not put this in citric acid because it will damage the graphite packing. If your valve stem has the graphite packing intact, I wouldn't put that in the citric acid or the vinegar because it will damage the graphite packing. As far as the fount goes, clean it. Simple Green is really good on these, although if it's a water slide decal, no problems with Simple Green. If it's a vinyl decal, and this should be a vinyl decal considering the age, at least the Canadian ones are like that, Simple Green will actually take the red off. So I'm just going to use soap and water on the fount. If you don't want to get any water in there, you could screw the valve in and put the cap on, and the check valve. You could do all this when you do a dunk test. You can clean this up when you do a dunk test or before you take all those parts off. If you really want it to look nice and to shine up, some automotive polish, or I really like to use Mother's Matte polish on it and polish it with a rag, and then use car wax will make it really shine up. And you can watch that in many of my other videos as you can the cleaning process with citric acid and steel wool. If you really want to make the brass parts shine, you can steel wool them after cleaning them in the acid bath. And then if you really want to shine them up, which they didn't come that way from the factory, but I will do this, you can use a buffing wheel on a bench grinder or on a Dremel, what have you, what do you have available, and really shine them up. And the same goes for these guys, the burner frame. This can go in citric acid. The plating on this is prone to coming off, so I would be very gentle with this. I wouldn't leave it in for very long. Typically, in fact, this may not even need it. This just may need a rub down with some steel wool. We'll see. But you can clean these up with some steel wool and simple green. If they're really rusty, that's when you want to put them in the citric acid. If they're really rusty, the plating is probably all gone anyways. You don't have to worry about that. If they're really rusty, the plating's gone, whatever, you want to shine them up, you can hit them with a wire wheel or something like that. It's kind of up to you how far you want to go. I'm not going to show you that in this video because this video is just about taking it apart and making sure it works and putting it back together so everything runs right. As far as sort of that restoration process and how fancy you want to make it look, that's up to you. And you can look at some of my other videos to see that. So I'm going to do all of that, and you'll see me again when everything's cleaned up and we're ready to reassemble it. All right, everything's ready to go back together. So the fount, this is nice and shiny, cleaned up well. I was cautious with the decal. These vinyl decals can be polished off or cleaned off. A simple green will strip those off really easily. So this is just polished with Mother's Mag polish and car wax. That looks great. Vent, globe, those were cleaned with simple green. The collar, collars over the years came in all sorts of different materials. Usually they were steel. I think this is aluminum on the E. I can't remember if these were brushed or not. On the F, these were brushed aluminum, and they polish up beautifully. If you really want to make them shine, they look really sharp, but that's not original. I did that on this, I think, just because they tend to get corroded, and if you want to clean the corrosion off, it means polishing the aluminum. But this was pristine, so I just hit it with some simple green and water and a sponge and cleaned it up, and I'm going to leave it original. The only thing that isn't spectacular on this was the burner frame, or the cage. The outside's okay. Some of the plating's still on here, so I don't want to do too much. There's just a little bit of rust down here in the bottom. So I'm going to leave that as it is and not go overboard with it. And we've got all of our parts here, air tubes, valves, all this stuff. You don't have to go this far. Like I said, shoot it out with carb cleaner and it'll probably be just fine. Clean out the air tubes with a brush or stick a zip tie or a wire in there and put it in your drill chuck and spin it around to make sure that it's clear, and that's fine. But these have all been polished on a buffing wheel, so they're nice and shiny because I kind of want to make this a showpiece. I've already put the valve stem back together because I replaced the graphite packing, and I will put a link to that video up above if you want to see how to do that. And so we're going to start putting this thing back together. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the pump. I didn't take this apart, I just cleaned it and polished it as it is because this has one of the push-on clips on there and they're just a pain to get apart. So this needs some oil. The cup's in good shape. It's a little firm, but that's all right. I'm just going to oil this. I'll let that soak for a minute while we put the check valve back in. Set it in the collar there. I'm using 3-in-1 oil. Coleman used neat's foot oil. Anything that's not vegetable oil or olive oil or something like that will be just fine. Vegetable oil over time will get gummed up and it will harden on the pump cup, and that's not good. But 3-in-1 oil, motor oil is okay. So fuel cap back on. This wouldn't hurt to have a new gasket on it, but the gasket that's there is working, so I'm going to leave it for now. The check valve, I didn't put this in the citric acid. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but I can hear it. The little ball is rattling, and I can blow on it, and it doesn't pass air. No, I can't blow with enough pressure, or the amount of pressure that would be in the fount, but I did shoot some carburetor cleaner through there just in case there was any residue or debris that needed to come out. So we'll just thread it on the end of our tool. Get those ears in there. And we'll just drop that down in and get it started by hand. And that's good. Now for the pump, rather than screw the air stem in first and then try to get it lined up with this hole in the pump handle, it's easier to just put it in this way. And drop it down in there, wiping excess oil off. And then we want the screw holes or the clip holes lined up so that the oil hole is on top. And again, this has the little spring clip. So we'll just put it on there and use some pliers. And we'll grab that and pop it in. And working great. Now let's put the valve in. Like I said, because I replaced the graphite packing, that is the valve stem and the jam nut are already on there. So we just need to put together the fuel and air delivery system. So we've got the spring. I've given it a little bit of a stretch just in case, but I think it was all right. So the spring goes under on the bottom side of this, not some people put it on the top. It'll be jammed down forever that way, and then just drop it down into the fuel and air tube, and you can see the air wire poking out there, and it definitely pops back up. So we thread that into the bottom. If you've got problems lighting your lantern, you really need to get down this deep into it, because chances are, and this is where the problem is, either this hole is clogged or that spring is not lifting the thing up. So clocking is like this on a 220F. We want the pump on this side, the fuel cap on that side, and this directly in between. Coleman did use a thread locker. As you saw, it was difficult to get this out. We had to use the impact wrench. It really shouldn't, in theory, be necessary because this is brass and it's a tapered thread. You screw it in. Once it's tight, it should seal. But I like to use this Permatex Blue. It's a thread sealant, not a thread locker. So if you do have to take it apart, it won't be as difficult. Just use a little bit, except when it comes squirting out like that. No worries though. One of the advantages of using the thread sealant is if the clocking doesn't quite work out, or if to get it where we want it, it's not quite as tight as we would like, the thread sealant will make sure that it is tight enough. So that'll be okay. Of course, I've got slightly oily hands from that pump cup. I've got a very slippery fount from, so I'm going to go this way. I should have rubber or latex gloves on. That would make it much easier. All right. There we go, a little bit too far. And that's just right. So, all right. Sorry, it was a little bit awkward there. That's one of the problems when you do wax the fount. It gets a little bit slippery. Hard to hold on to. So we've got the valve in. So now I'm going to slip this on. We'll slide our collar over and we'll get our burner frame ready, and we'll get that upper part of the valve, the tip cleaning part, and we'll take that retainer nut and we'll thread that on, screw it up all the way as far as it'll go. Now, this is where clocking is more significant. So you see this hole, that's where this guy goes through, and then hopefully you can see how the hole for the air tube lines up with this off-center hole here. And the whole thing, the way it should work out is when we've got it clocked and assembled properly, this upright should be in line with the valve, and the tip cleaner should be about midway, not quite, but midway between the valve and the fuel cap. So, what to do, get the groove seated, and the groove in the cage will drop down into the collar. So, and I'm going to add just a very small amount of thread sealant here. You definitely don't want too much here. One of the very first lanterns I ever worked on, actually it was one of these, and I got just a little bit too much and it ended up running down into the valve there. And yeah, and this is just it's a tight fit, so we're gonna have to leave that cardboard out and just be really careful here. That's probably about right. Let's get what I want to do is look here and make sure that's lined up properly, and that appears to be so. We've got this vertical lined up with the valve, and actually it looks like the upper part there needs to go just a little bit further. Not very far at all, but just a little bit. Okay, lined up here. And we're lined up. So that should be good. I just moved everything. Double check. Good. Triple, quadruple check. Now we want to tighten down this nut. And we managed to do this without scratching the fount, even though we didn't have the cardboard in there, so I'm happy about that. Before we get it too tight, I'm just going to make sure all around that the cage is seated in there, and it is inside the collar. Don't tighten this until you put a divot or a dimple or a dent in the burner frame. Just get it tight enough so that the cage doesn't move. So, that should be fine. Okay, now let's put the air tube. We need to actually put our whole air tube and manifold assembly back together because I took it all apart. So these polished up pretty nicely. All these are brass, but they're nickel plated, except for possibly this. And so we want to put the middle tube in first because it won't turn otherwise. And then we want to put get this screw in there and lined up. And tightened. again, this came apart extremely easily. I would be willing to bet that your 220 or your 228 will not. In fact, they may not come apart at all. It was nice that this did come apart, but you can't always count on it. If they do come apart, it's almost always going to be with a lot more work. The only time I've ever had one come apart as easily as this did was one that someone else had already taken apart fairly recently, and I was just taking it apart again. And we'll take our tape wrapped pliers and grab it by the burner cap so that we don't, you can tell that maybe that happened during assembly. It's all around, all the way around, so actually I don't think that came from someone wrenching on it. I think that's a manufacturing mark. And we're good. So now we've got our little set screw there. And what we want to do is get this hole lined up with that hole. It should be lined up. It's not that hard to do. It should be lined up when it stops turning or is close to stopping turning, because this is going to line up with the generator and the tip cleaner. So if this is in line and it won't go another full turn, it should be lined up. But you can kind of look in there and I can see that it is lined up. Your screw may be in the back here. I can't remember if this is a Canadian thing or if it's just a different in certain models. And don't just screw it in until it's tight. If it bottoms out before the screw head is flush, you haven't lined it up right. The screw needs to screw all the way in, not just up against the threads. So it should go all the way through that hole. There we go. Just like that. Now we need to put the tip cleaner back in and the eccentric block. And I've got a little trick here, because you drop this in and then this guy doesn't want to line up right. Sometimes this falls down too far. So I take a paper clip and I put a paper clip through there. You want it to drop in so that the notch is facing this way. So we'll just drop it in there. The paper clip will keep it from falling down. And then we just screw the tip cleaner in. That was a 3/8. Sometimes these want to thread in, or they easily thread in by hand until it gets to the very bottom. And others like this, you've got to put a wrench on there and do it half a turn at a time all the way in. I think we're almost there. Now let's we're still not in. You can tell when you're getting there because the eccentric block may start moving up and down as this rotates, at which point you need to slow down. We're not quite there yet. You need to slow down and make sure that the lever is actually engaging properly. Okay, now you can see the paper clip moved. So now we're going up and down here, so that's good. And that means that it is fully engaged. Sometimes you'll screw it in and it won't hit that notch. So that's good. Watch the paper clip flop around. Take the paper clip out and we're ready to put the generator on. So I simply cleaned the old one. This seems to have seen very little use, so I would feel bad throwing this away and buying a brand new one. Again, up there, I'll post a link to my generator cleaning video. So, this little hook needs to go from this direction through that little eyelet. So we'll feed the tip up into the air tube. I'll turn this, hopefully you can see a little better. Oh, and we need to put the generator nut on first. Where's that? This guy. That's what will hold it in place. So, up into the air tube. And then line up make sure the eccentric block is up. Turn the eccentric block down and we're good. All right, nice and tight there. And we're getting down to the bottom of the parts here. We've got our valve wheel. I cleaned that with some Simple Green. I cleaned the direction disc with soap and water. It was actually in fine shape. These are sort of painted or silk screened on, so be careful if you're aggressive with them, you'll take the lettering off. Sometimes if they are extremely dirty and it doesn't come off with soap and water or with Simple Green and water, I will use the Mother's Mag polish and very, very gently, just lightly rub it, paying very careful attention. If I see any fading of the lettering, then I stop and wipe it off. But if you use that very, very gently, and if it's really dirty and it doesn't want to come off, that's one thing that will help. So, valve wheel feels good as far as the resistance. It's a little squeaky with that new graphite in there. That'll resolve once it gets hot. Our tip cleaner feels good. This is about as tight as it should be. We didn't mess with this graphite. So there we have it. Got our nicely polished ball nut, Canadian one, vertical splines as opposed to the knurling. So yeah, I think she looks great. This one's a little bit unusual. The E's have the decal back here. Some of the E's have it in the front. The F's almost always have the decal opposite, on the back opposite the valve knob. And for some reason, I don't know if someone was new at the factory that day, or it was 4 o'clock on a Friday, or what the deal is, but the decal ended up under the fuel cap. And so I don't know, the 220F, the Canadian, is rare enough. I've only seen a few of these, so I don't know if that's a common variant or what, but I think it looks pretty good. So let's put some mantles on here and we'll get her fired up. These take number 21 mantles. Coleman, these are old silk lights. If you really want it to shine bright, these are the things to use. They're from back in the days when they were using thorium, which is ever so slightly radioactive. These are the best mantles. They last forever and they're bright, but I tend to save my silk lights for lanterns that I burn a lot, and this is not going to be one of those. So I'm going to go with these Peerless 2CHGs. They're the equivalent of a Coleman 21. And these current Peerless mantles are not spectacular, but they are better than the current Coleman number 21s, which have some, I don't know if it's a quality control issue or they're just not manufacturing them well or what, but the current Coleman mantles just are not terribly good quality. So I will put one, gather these up just a little bit and put one loop in here just to prep them. And I will tie these on. You want the, like they're flat, so you want that to go against the generator. You don't want the side that sticks out riding on the generator or anything. So we'll pull that tight and try to spread out some of the gathering around the burner cap. So got that on there, and always remember to cut these off. Every once in a while, if you're really unlucky and you don't cut them off, they'll curl down and poke a hole in the mantle, and you don't want that. All right, there we go. Now we want to burn these in. When you burn them in, it burns off the whatever, if it's rayon or fabric, whatever. On the old ones, presumably it was silk, which is why they called them silk lights. But the fabric mesh is embedded with metal oxides. On these, the active thing that probably makes it grow is most likely yttrium. That's what Coleman currently uses. I'm assuming Peerless uses something similar. They no longer use thorium, but when that burns off, it leaves a fragile mesh of metal oxides, and that's what glows when the flame hits it. It's actually the flame or the heat causing the mantles to glow. What you're not actually seeing the fire that's coming out from the burning fuel. It's the mantles that luminesce when they're heated. And we'll just let those go for a minute, and with the magic of video editing, I'll be back and we'll have this thing ready to go. All right, let's pump this guy up. Unscrew it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. That should be enough for starters. Sometimes if these are overpressurized, 220s are notorious for pulsing, so start simple. My suggestion, if you have never done this before, this is the point at which you probably want to take it outside. If you're not accustomed to doing this, safety first. You don't want a fire in the house or the garage. Have a fire extinguisher or something of that nature handy, just in case. It's pumped up, so I would check it at this point, let it sit for a minute, and watch, and just make sure you don't have gasoline running out from under the collar or running down inside around the tip cleaner and the generator or anything like that. You know, hopefully you've made sure everything is tight, but if you've never done this before, it's easy to forget something. So safety first, just give it a visual inspection after a minute or so once it's got pressure in it. But everything's looking good, so we're ready to light it up. But the first thing, because the fuel system on this is bone dry, The first thing I'm going to do is open it a quarter turn, and I'll hear it hiss with the air, but what I want to hear is a gurgling or a spitting sound as that little bit of fuel comes up past the air stem and up into the generator. When I hear that spitting or gurgling sound, then I know it's ready to light. I'll shut it off. I'll give it a chance to expel that vapor from the combustion chamber there. Sometimes if you clean the generator, there may be a little bit of bits of carbon or something from the spring or the cardboard or asbestos tube in the generator. Or if, for example, you use the asbestos tube, maybe you got it wet. The generator may throw a few bits of garbage or carbon or something. So the first few light ups, you may have to use the tip cleaner to expel that or to clean that out. And it may give you a little bit of grief when you're trying to light it. But just manipulate the tip cleaner and it should go. So let's see what we hear. I hear the hiss. All right, hear that? That's what we want to hear. So blow those fumes out. That spitting means we're getting fuel, just enough to light. Put that up through the hole. So the generator is heating up now. Let's see, it's not, the generator's fine, that's not a problem. I'll go ahead and open it all the way now. It's hot. It's not burning very brightly, so let's add a little more pressure. All right, there we go. Let me get the lights. All ready for a camping trip. So I hope that helped. If you need to refurbish a lantern, if you have questions, throw them down in the comments. I'll see what I can answer. And enjoy.